Hello, everyone. And for those in Victoria, I'm sorry that you will be with us from your bedrooms again. Hopefully, this lockdown doesn't go for too long. But just as a note, if any of you are struggling or having any problems, feel free to give my office a call. We're there for you. We might be able to help. Who knows? There might be something we can do to help you in whatever you might be struggling with. But I'm very pleased for your lunchtime pleasure to be joined by Dr. Alex Wodak. I'm sure he is no stranger to anyone who has interacted with our Facebook over the last 5 or 6 years. Dr. Alex Wodak has been a pioneer in drug law reform, but more importantly, in harm reduction in Australia and internationally. He's well renowned. And right now, if you follow his Twitter feed, which I encourage you to do, you'll see that a lot of Alex's focus at the moment has been on vaping and on tobacco harm reduction. So we thought it would be great to have a chat about where Australia's sitting, what we can do in Australia, and also acknowledge that yesterday was International Tobacco Free Day, or as many of us were naming it, International Vaping Day. So, Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much. Let me explain why I've spent the last 5 years more focused on vaping than I had on drug law reform. Firstly, there are two reasons for it. Firstly, we're making progress on drug law reform. Worldwide especially, but even in Australia, miserable progress in Australia, but there is some progress. We've won the debate on drug law reform in Australia, and we know that pill testing is going to happen. It's just it's a when question, not a whether question. We know that the legalization of recreational cannabis will happen. It's a when question, not a whether question anymore. So these things have now got a lot of momentum, and what's particularly encouraging for me is the number of young people involved in that effort. And when lots of young people are involved in something, you know that the future looks very good. So that's one reason. The second reason is that however much progress we are making in drug law reform, we're not making that progress on the vaping issue. We started way behind. We're the rich country that is most hostile to vaping. We're the only rich country that requires medical prescription for nicotine. And smoking is a huge issue in Australia. 21,000 deaths a year from smoking. Now that's more than the combined deaths from alcohol plus prescription plus illicit drugs plus suicide, plus road crashes, plus HIV. It's colossally important. Yes, many of them, of the people who die from smoking, are old. So they're not many what epidemiologists call life years lost. But still, there are more life years lost from tobacco than from alcohol. And about a third of those deaths occur in people of working age. So it's not true that they're all old elderly people. And also it disproportionately affects low-income, disadvantaged Indigenous people. So that's another reason to be concerned. And it's not just a health issue, it's a wealth issue as well. Yeah. So somebody who smokes 20 cigarettes a day in Australia spends $12,500 a year. Somebody who vapes spends about $1,000 a year. So getting low-income disadvantaged people with mental illness, people with alcohol and drug problems to switch from smoking to vaping not only improves their health, but also their economic well-being. And that's pretty important when we've had sluggish wage growth for almost a decade.
Absolutely, Alex. And I think, we don't have to look much further than our family across the ditch, where they've acknowledged that wealth issue. And I was reading an article over the weekend that was, it was an interview with a young Maori woman who was getting behind New Zealand's campaign to be tobacco free by smoke free by 2025. And she said that, smoking was just, you bought a packet of cigarettes when you were happy, you bought 2 packs when you were sad. And it was really part of her family culture. But one of the rules was, if you wanted to smoke, you had to pay for them yourself, which meant that a bunch of young people actually left school and ended their education to fund their tobacco habit. And so the rolling effect that it had on the Maori population in New Zealand. And if we might just touch on what New Zealand is doing and some of the success that they've had. I know you've been in touch with Marawea Glover.
Yes. And she is not just a New Zealand leader on the issue of smoking among Indigenous people. She's really a world figure in that area. No, New Zealand came later to this point of view than the United Kingdom, which was really the first rich country that back in 2010 made a decision to follow tobacco harm reduction. And that was under the Conservatives, that was under David Cameron as Prime Minister. So New Zealand came slowly to that. There was a very important court case that the Ministry of Health in New Zealand brought against Philip Morris against a heated tobacco product. And the judge, who had no previous exposure to this area, no known position on this area, heard the arguments of the tobacco company and heard the arguments of the Ministry of Health and threw out the Ministry of Health case. The Ministry of Health then held a 2-day private workshop, and they decided that they couldn't overturn the judgment. The judgment was so solid, and they couldn't afford to run a case either. And so they decided to accept it. And then they've gone through a period of digesting what has to be done to make tobacco harm reduction the rule in New Zealand. And we're now, and they've taken a long time to do that, to be honest, but then the legislation was passed last year. And importantly, that legislation was passed with the support of 4 major parties. The Labor Party, which was in government with the Greens, so the Labor and the Greens passed it, and the New Zealand First, and also the Nationals, which were the equivalent of Australia's Liberals and National Party. So it was across the board, which is very important. If you get across the board political support in this difficult area, it's likely to endure, it's likely to stay. So we will see in New Zealand in years to come, the smoking rate will drop faster than in Australia. We've had a virtually flat smoking rate in Australia since 2013, whereas countries where vaping rates have zoomed up seen their smoking rate zoom down.
Yes.
And so that means that in years to come, heart disease, lung disease, and cancers will start declining faster in US, UK, and New Zealand than they are in Australia.
I think it was really heartfelt yesterday, just seeing the personal testimonies that were flooding into Twitter and certainly into my feed, and I suspect into yours, of people just talking about how it had saved their lives and how it had the impact that it had on people's lives to be able to do something good for themselves, to be able to experience being able to smell food again and the rest of it. And just as you mentioned, I mean, we know that, well, almost with everything, that when we criminalise a drug, or when we, as we're doing now, almost moving to criminalise an alternative to tobacco, we affect the most marginalised and we affect the lowest socioeconomic. And that is what has been coming out loud and clear in all of the personal testimonies as well.
Look, I think it's important to very quickly look at the 4 most common political positions, political philosophies, if you like. So to a libertarian, it is just nonsense to restrict the choice of people when that choice involves a much lower risk option than smoking. So that's why the libertarians are so strong on this issue, because they see it as a libertarian issue. They see everything as a libertarian issue. And this one is so crystal clear. Yeah. Then there are the fiscal conservatives who want low taxes, small government. And here's a case where the smokers are paying for their own harm reduction, are paying for their own quit smoking. It's not the taxpayer that's footing the bill, it's the smoker himself or herself. So, of course, fiscal conservatives like it. The social justice advocates should like it as well. And the reason they should like it is because 40% of cigarettes bought in the United States and UK are estimated to be bought by people with severe mental illness. Presumably that's the same in Australia as well. So if we look at the populations in Australia where smoking is above the average, it's low income, disadvantaged, homeless, mentally ill, severe alcohol and drug problems, Indigenous, those sort of populations. So how can social justice advocates not flock to support tobacco harm reduction, vaping in particular? And then there are the environmentalists. Well, we do know that cigarette butts left in the lying around in the bush stay there for decades, if not centuries. They're a terrible pollutant, not just of land, but of our beaches, of our seas. Also, smoking is a terrible pollutant of the air. And it's a significant cause still of bushfires and of domestic fires. So you'd think the Greens would be natural allies on this issue. And yet we're in a position here where there is politics is polarized. So it's unsustainable. And I think what's going to happen when the government proceeds with the plans they've got for October the 1st, that it'll work for a while and then it will fall apart.
We're already seeing the illicit tobacco industry growing exponentially in Australia. And, you know, you would think that vaping actually could be one of those sensible ways of moving away from the criminal market, treating this drug use as a health issue, as we, you know, that mantra is repeated constantly, but it seems where we're going with tobacco harm reduction is exactly the opposite way. We're going to turn people into criminals.
There are two other reasons why we're going to eventually win the vaping issue. One reason is because vaping is very much becoming a social movement. And that happened also with harm reduction. So we went from 240,000 people estimated to vape in 2016 to 520,000 vaping estimated in 2019, according to the National Drug Strategy Household Survey. So almost doubled in 3 years. So presumably a lot more than 520,000 people now. And that itself got two effects. One effect is that a lot more vapers are saying to their friends who still smoke, listen, what about trying this? So it's going to keep on accelerating. The other thing is that that has to sooner or later have political ramifications. And the other reason for this, of course, is the economic and financial driver behind all this. This is a disruptive innovation, and just as film cameras were powerless to stop the onslaught by digital cameras when that started, and smartphones swept away the Blackberries, and Blackberries swept away the Nokias, and Nokias swept away the landline phones. We're seeing exactly the same thing happening here. So our opponents who defend the virtual ban on vaping in Australia don't have a chance. They'll be swept away by the combination of harm reduction, a social movement, and a disruptive innovation.
So on the 1st of October, could you just outline where we'll be? I mean, I think I've been very public in saying that I've managed to quit smoking after many years, and vaping assisted me in doing that without a doubt. And I got a prescription for it, and certainly that was through your organisation, ATHRA, the Association for Australian Association for Tobacco Harm Reduction. So on the 1st of October, what are the changes that we will see here?
This is Greg Hunt, the Minister for Health's third attempt to bring a new regime in to, as he calls it, tighten the loopholes. But in fact, what it's going to mean is to make the restrictions even tighter. Yeah. So at the moment, people who have a medical prescription that is valid, that is less than 12 months old, are allowed to legally import 4 times a year, every 3 months, a quantity of vaping equipment that they need. And provided they possess that prescription, there's no illegality either in the importation or the possession. But that's going to change on the 1st of October, and the requirement will be for the Border Force to inspect incoming vaping equipment and also nicotine liquid, and that will have to be accompanied by a copy of the prescription. And if there's no copy of the prescription, it will be seized. The pharmacies will be allowed to sell nicotine liquid and also vaping equipment legally. Again, the person will need a prescription for that vaping liquid. Now, the problem with all of this is that smokers are certainly not interested in going through that sort of rigmarole to get something that they can get something similar much more conveniently. They can go down to a convenience store or a service station, and they don't have to jump through all these hoops to get that. So what are they going to do? Many of them will go back to smoking, and many of them will go back to the black market and buy from the black market. And the problem with that is the black market is completely unregulated. And maybe I'm biased, but black markets, in my view, are trouble. There's no quality control, and our opponents will exploit that. That the inevitable adverse consequences of their policy will then become propaganda that they will try and make use of for their own political purposes. But I think, so one problem is that smokers don't want it. Another problem is there are very few doctors who are interested in writing prescriptions here after years and years and years of being told that nicotine is highly dangerous and causes cancer. They're not going to write prescriptions. They're going to be worried that the table will turn and they'll get into trouble. So doctors won't be interested. And it seems that very few pharmacists will be interested as well. So I think sooner or later, either Greg Hunt or a future Minister for Health will have to reverse this process and accept the reality.
And I spoke to some pharmacists about this last week, and these were community pharmacists, and it was interesting. I think they had quite a sensible take, although it was also a little bit unimaginable that they sort of said to me, they said, "Oh, well, we see this just like methadone," which is, I mean, I suppose it's absolutely true in some ways, and that they see their role in distributing methadone as part of a harm reduction policy, and that these pharmacists would have seen their role in distributing vaping equipment much in the same way.
Yes, but there are a lot of problems with this. One is that smokers switching from cigarettes to vaping require a fair amount of support from people who really know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And I've been involved in this area for 5 years, and I know a lot of the kind of theoretical stuff about it, but I haven't really got a clue about the practical nitty-gritty stuff. People who know that are ex-smokers and who are now vaping and who work in vape shops. They really know what they're talking about. So the pharmacists are going to be struggling, the doctors are going to be struggling, and neither of them are really going to feel comfortable with it. The core problem, it's important to come back to what the core problem is. The core problem here is the lack of real commitment to harm reduction. That's what's really going on. It's really at the crux of this, it's a battle between the prohibitionists and the harm reductionists. That's the problem. And we don't have a strong enough commitment across the board in Australia to harm reduction.
And why are those lines different? It seems to me that, some of the people that you would have thought would have been on the harm reduction side are actually on the prohibition side. And I put people like Simon Chapman in there, and Rob Moody in there, that, in the past, you would have imagined them to be on the side of harm reduction, not in the salvation, Major Waters just say no camp. But
well, I think there are two reasons for it. There are probably many reasons, but for me, there are two main reasons. One reason is that all these people who have been warriors for trying to reduce smoking and who attacked the tobacco industry absolutely rightly when it was impregnable fortress, and who got punished by big tobacco for the temerity of trying to challenge them. They all suffered at the hands of big tobacco. Big tobacco is very nasty, and these people were all hurt and damaged in the process. So it's not a surprise to me that they now take the attitude that this is just another twist or turn, and this is big tobacco playing dirty tricks again, and conning people like you and me who haven't been involved in the debate. So I think that's one reason. I think the other reason is that these people have been warriors for decade after decade and who've made a significant achievements and helped to reduce our smoking rates, no doubt, can now see their relevance disappearing. They've built up prestigious positions with high status. They're on first name terms with ministers. They're highly regarded. They're the go-to people in the media. And here comes this new invention in 2003 that comes on the market in 2006. And then now 68 million people are using around the world. And they can see just as well as you and I can that this is going to take away everything they've built up for decades. And they've chosen the wrong side. And once they've chosen the wrong side, they can't do anything about that. That's what they're stuck with.
We're going to have to wind up, Alex. But just I know you were at the or watching or attending the e-cigarette US summit last week, and there's just 2 points. And I think the first point I wanted to ask was that there was 2 FDA officials there, which is the Food and Drug Association or Authority in America, and they seemed to indicate that there was actually going to be some approval processes for some of the vaping products coming down the line. Is that a game changer, or is it? I mean, the UK has already been down this path of recognising the health benefits. Or, I mean, will this help us in Australia?
Yes, the approval process for a previous product, heated tobacco product, which came last year or the year before, required a stack of paper that would have been equivalent to the height of a 20-story building. So just imagine the cost to Philip Morris International that lodged that application. don't think of that lightly. But I think the other thing that came out of the meeting in Washington is that people at long last on the pro-vaping side are now saying what we should have all said a long time ago, and that is that the arguments put by the opponents of vaping are arrant nonsense. They're ludicrous. They are totally dishonest. They're based on voodoo science. And we've hinted at that and said that for years. Now we're all saying it out in the open because it's true.
Yeah.
And I think whether or not that will change things is open to question, but I'm glad that's out. And anybody watching this, please go to that summit, that e-cigarette summit, watch Ethan Nagelman's closing address, drawing the parallels between the war on drugs and the war on vaping. It's very, very powerful. And what he says is spectacularly right.
Yeah. We'll put the link to that. And again, it goes back to where we know that the war on drugs, who it affected the most, which is where we started in this conversation, that it affects some low socioeconomic people, it affects marginalised groups. And from that perspective, we should be seeing this as a human rights perspective and a social justice issue, as we did with the war on drugs. And I think I would hope that our politicians would start to understand that. Unfortunately, from a state level, we can convince every state politician here, but we actually do need probably a change of health minister, because it sits with Greg Hunt.
No, Victoria can go it alone. Victoria doesn't have to be part of the national system. And I hope Victoria or some other state or territory will defect from the national system and go it alone.
Well, hopefully, when our Minister of Health has got some downtime during this lockdown, which he does not have any downtime, but he'll watch this and start thinking about how we might be able to go it alone. There's a challenge set for myself and my other colleagues in Victoria to advocate to see if we can get Victoria to lead in this significant health issue and the significant social justice issue. Again, thank you, Alex, for all the work you do and for joining us today.
Pleasure. Bye for now.